Hi, everybody. This is Eve Harrow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network. You can always write to me, Eve at thelandofisrael.com. I am now sitting in Ramat Gan being, I guess, one of the satellite towns around Tel Aviv. And I'm sitting with Carice Witte, founder and executive director of the Sino-Israel Global Network and academic leadership this is called Signal. So I suppose as close as we're going to get to somebody who can help us understand China is sitting with me right now. So thank you so much, Carice, for taking time during a busy workday to sit with me here on the Land of Israel Network.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here and to hopefully convey some insights into understanding China that your audience doesn't necessarily have.
Okay, so I think a lot of us, on the one hand, China seems like this communistic, totalitarian regime with a great history, the Ming Dynasty and all this fabulous history, maybe the only nation in the world that has a history as long as the Jewish people, right? On the other hand, pretty much maybe 50% of everything that we have in our homes right now would probably say made in China. So in the last few years, there seems to have been a major change in what China is in who China is, in China's relationship to the West. Is it opening up? Is it closing off? Is it taking advantage of all of us? So I'm confused. I'm sure that a lot of my listeners are confused. And the reason that I had met you a few months ago and that I took your card so that we could sit here one day is because I'm seeing a lot of Chinese tourists here in Israel. So clearly they've got some disposable income. They're fascinated about this country. I know more people are going to visit China. So it piqued my curiosity. And again, I want to thank you so much for taking time to help explain to me and, of course, to my listeners, who are the best listeners in the world, exactly what is Israel's relationship with China, and as much as you can, what is China?
So let's start with what is China. And that will help also put it in context with Israel's relationship with China. So you started by saying China has this amazing history, and that history was one that is unique probably in the world in that it was very introverted. China has a tremendous culture, and even the symbol for China is a square with a line in the middle, meaning the center of the universe or the center of the world. And that was very much the framework that they dealt with the world. They did not have a lot of interaction with other countries. The local countries around China paid tribute, and the emperor was the son of God. Cut to 1911, and China started to go through a revolution due to corruption and really the failure of the emperor to be able to serve the people. And little by little, there was a rebellion, and then we know that China became the People's Republic of China Communist State in 1949. And with that, China responded to a great extent to what they call the 100 Years of Humiliation. In the 1800s, the British and the Chinese had the Opium War. And from that point, the Chinese great self-image began to deteriorate. And that lasted more or less until 2010, to really oversimplify. During the time of Mao, China tried to rebuild itself and redistribute wealth and reorganize the nation to rejuvenate from the suffering that they had gone through. After World War II, there was a Japanese invasion. There was the massacre of Nanjing, which many Chinese see sort of in light of the Holocaust. For them, this was the death of millions of Chinese. And they were trying to rebuild their nation. In 1979, Mao had passed away. The country was taken over by, or the new leader was Deng Xiaoping. And he instituted a new program of opening up and reform. And that opening up and reform led to what you mentioned about in our households, we see half of everything may be made in China because China became basically the factory of the world, manufacturing and producing an incredible range of goods and building a great deal of capital within the national leadership treasury. So China was able, within 30 years, to transform the lives of hundreds of millions of people, raise them from poverty into middle class and higher, and become, by many definitions, a wealthy nation. If you look at across the board GDP, they still are a developing nation. But in many ways, they're also a developed nation. And in 2010, they became their economy was officially recognized as the second largest in the world. Wow. And that started to transform their own self-image.
Which is the first, by the way?
The U.S. And they're projected to overtake the U.S. within 15 to 20 years as far as GDP. There are other ways to calculate the macroeconomics, which put them at the top at this point. But in any case, China also in 2010 decided to become the world's innovators, to go beyond manufacturing and introduce innovation as a national project. So the relationship between Israel and China had changed beginning at that point. And if we go back historically to that relationship, in 1956, the Chinese went to the Bandung Conference and signed a basic agreement with the Arab world, with the Muslim world, which meant that their relationship with Israel was going to be extremely limited. Even though Israel was the first country in the Middle East to recognize China's establishment, the PRC's establishment in 1949. That relationship remained very distant until the 70s, when a well-known personality, Shaul Eisenberg, began to trade with China, and some of the trading in military goods that he did involved Israel, and that opened up a way of communication. And for a lot of complex reasons that I won't go into now, Israel and China started to warm up towards each other. And in 1992, we signed official diplomatic relations. That relationship continued to strengthen on a military and intelligence level until 2000, when a very important deal that our military was doing with China was stopped suddenly because of instructions from the United States, and not to sell certain advanced warning system to the Chinese. Again, it's very complicated, and without going into detail, suffice it to say that caused the relationship between China and Israel, which had been in a sort of honeymoon phase, to take a major nosedive. Then in 2004, China sent a Harpy drone that they had purchased from Israel for repair, and we were told not to return the Harpy by the Americans. And as a result, basically, formal diplomatic interactions came to a quiet halt.
So essentially, the United States, for their own reasons, got involved with the Israel-Chinese relationship and kind of put a spanner in the works, if you will, because of their own reasons?
Absolutely. But Israel explains that because the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is definitely a priority, remains a priority, and will remain a priority, Israel understands that it has to make certain concessions for the sake of that relationship. And in fact, even China understands, although they were very displeased for many years. There, on many levels, they did understand then, and they certainly understand now that Israel has to do what it has to do, just like China has to do what it has to do. And what happened in 2010 with regard to China's confidence growing due to its economic strengthening and its interest in innovation caused them to open their eyes more towards Israel. That's at the same time that I established Signal. I happened to be fortunate enough to be in China when those two statements were announced in the summer of 2010, which strengthened my resolve to actually get this organization off the ground, which basically advances China-Israel relations within an academic framework.
So let me just ask you, because it begs the question, what were you doing in China in 2010?
That's a very good question. It was multi-purpose. My son was actually studying, just the word just escaped me, Kung Fu. My son was studying Kung Fu for a year at the Shaolin Temple School in, a far-off place in China, far away from anything, in a very small town. And I had agreed with him that when he was, after 6 months, I would go, because I had studied China in university, and I had worked in China. I was very interested in China. And
what were you doing at the time, professionally?
Back then?
Yeah,
in 2010. So I just came to visit him. But what happened was, during the first 6 months of his trip, I had started my due diligence and research on establishing Signal. So actually, I put the two together, and I did some specific research in China on Signal, and was touring with my son around China.
And what had you been doing up until that time to prepare you? Because this cannot be a simple thing to be doing here. Do you speak Chinese? I know there is no Chinese.
Actually,
Is there?
Well, now Chinese is known as Mandarin. Okay. Yes. So I spoke Chinese back when I studied it in the early 80s. And when I made Aliyah in 1987, I tried to use it, and I tried to deal with China here, but there was absolutely no interest and no venue. So it's definitely one of those languages which is use it or lose it. And unfortunately, I lost it. Although I'm working on reinvigorating my Chinese. It's a lifelong process. But I became interested in establishing this organization for very personal reasons that have to do with the challenges that Israel faces, the endless delegitimization of Israel. And I wanted to make a contribution to helping neutralize that delegitimization from in an area where I could have some added value. And at the time, when I was doing my research beginning in 2009, I saw that China was a non-issue in Israel. Like there was almost nothing happening between our countries, and it seemed to me that clearly China is on a trajectory of growth, and we should be looking in that direction in order to be prepared and also help China prepare if they're going to be coming to the Middle East. Everybody knows that China's dependent on Iranian oil, Saudi oil, and therefore the Middle East is critical for them. Do they understand the Middle East? No. And therefore, it's our responsibility to help China understand both Israel and the Middle East, so that when they are starting to take decisions about policy in this region, they come from a position of understanding and not misunderstandings or misconceptions, which are rife all over the world about China. All over the world about Israel. What is wonderful and unique about China is that there's no indigenous anti-Semitism. The opposite. They are philo-Semitics. They have an excellent opinion of the Jewish people and, by extension, the Jewish state. So,
why is that? What their state religion is? Confucius? What is it? Do they have a state religion? Everybody does their own thing. It's not a big deal.
It's an atheist country. Communism is superseded any religion. When I was in China last month, I was told that the national religion is nationalism. There are some Christians, there are Muslims, there are Taoists and Buddhists, but basically you're not supposed to be affiliated with any religion if you are a member of the Communist Party. And being a member of the Communist Party is definitely a goal of many of the millions and millions of Chinese.
So that's literally the party line. But for example, we see a lot of Russians here in Israel who also, the communists said, no religion, but really now I see a tremendous number from the Orthodox Church, from the Russian Orthodox Church. So people seem to have put their religion aside, but when they could express it again, they came back to something that they're comfortable with. But you're saying that in China, in order to belong to the Communist Party, you have to put that aside. So you think officially and unofficially people are atheists, that their respect for the Jewish people is more of a national thing, not necessarily a religious one? How would you define that?
No, their respect for the Jewish people has nothing to do with their view of religion.
Okay.
As I said, there are Christians and every other religion in China. There are no indigenous Jews. There are only expat Jews in China. However, what I'm saying, and I don't think we need to belabor it because it's not core issue for China. It's basically an atheist country, and there are 1.4 billion people. So you have people of all religions and many, many ethnicities. And so, everything goes. It just depends on where you are in society, what is more applicable. The respect for the Jewish people comes from an awareness of history and the remarkable path that the Jews have experienced over 4,000 more years, where they sort of see the Jews as the miracle people. How did we survive and thrive under such incredibly harsh conditions for millennia after millennia? And most especially in recent years. So, the Chinese, Marx was Jewish. Einstein was Jewish. These you see statues of these men all over China because they contributed so much to society, and the Chinese appreciate that. And there's a general myth in China that Jews are very clever, very wise, and have a lot to contribute to society, and actually do contribute. So they come from a positive place in general, which makes working there a pleasure.
So I have some relatives, actually some of my father's relatives, when they fled Germany when the Nazis came to power, who ended up spending quite a few years in Shanghai. So not only were they not anti-Semitic, but it appears that, and they weren't the only ones, that quite a few Jews were sheltered in China during World War II. So that's a lovely thing as well.
Absolutely. Also in Harbin and in which is northeastern China. Shanghai is famous for that. But even it's interesting to note that 1,000 years ago, Jews were escaping pogroms and crossing on the ancient Silk Road and ended up in China and were given a whole town of Kaifeng and made their home there and were allowed to keep all of their kashrut and other traditions. And there was such a lack of anti-Semitism that over the centuries, they eventually intermarried and disappeared.
Right. Yeah, I have heard that. One day I'll get to China. It just, from people that I know that have gone, they say it's absolutely a fascinating place. Okay, so you are in a lot having to do with the academia. Has Israel we have established a university in China now? Is that part of what they're trying to do? If they're trying to be innovators, it's clear why they would look at Israel, because this is, if not the most innovative country in the world, it's probably in the top 2 or 3. So has that also helped you with what you're doing here? Is all this kind of a perfect storm, great timing? You were there in 2010 and able to establish Signal. And now what I'm trying to ask is, are you pushing Israel in this direction? Are you cause, are you effect, or is it happening together? Has El Al started direct flights to Beijing because of you, or is it all kind of happening all together? How does Signal fit into this?
Okay, so we are definitely a niche market in that we established the field of Israel studies in China. Until 2000 through 2010. There was no place in the entire country where you could take a class at any academic level on Israel. In 2011, we established the first university with Israel studies programs, and we now have 13 across the country with thousands of students taking scores of classes, producing hundreds of research papers every year about Israel. So
what do you mean you established? Where's the money coming from? Who is this? Who is this?
So Signal is a nonprofit organization that is funded almost 100% by very visionary Jewish philanthropists in America who understand the value of building long-term relations and long-term relations with China. But it didn't take a tremendous amount of money to establish. We didn't fund chairs. We don't do things in the Western way. We do things in the Chinese way. So this has made us very successful in developing our vast network, both across the country in academia and also in Beijing, with the scholars who advise on Middle East and other areas that are relevant for Israel.
So you have sent scholars from Israel. If there was no school and no classes you could take about Israel, so you're starting from scratch. So it's not like you can pull professors from an existing university and establish another university. So did you have to look for people who were expert in Israel and send them to China? And when you're giving these classes and people writing papers on Israel, who's teaching them?
So that is very important, of course. And what we did immediately, before we established the first one, we began bringing Chinese faculty from China to Israel to study Israel studies, people who already had advanced degrees in international relations, politics and law, history, Middle East. So they, of course, it's not like doing a PhD on Israel itself, but they had enough expertise in their field that we could bring them here for a full semester of very intensive Israel studies, you could say, teacher training, which was done the first 2 years at Bar-Ilan University, and then we moved to Ben Gurion to the International Israel Studies program in Sde Boker, where we have excellent partners, and we have sent over 50 faculty over the years now to go through this program. While they're there, we work with them on developing the course that they will go back and teach. And again, this is not a degree program. This is a track within within a larger degree. So, for example, in history, in the history department of Henan University, they have Israel studies. In the politics and law degree of Shihezi University in Xinjiang in far western China, they have Israel studies. In the Oriental Studies department in Shanghai International Studies University, they now have Israel studies.
And these are being taught by indigenous Chinese who have come to Israel and learned about Israel enough to be able to go back and then impart it to the students there.
Exactly. And we also send Israeli faculty who are obviously Israel studies professors. And we send every university, every semester has a lecture series by one of these professors. So we started out when we had fewer schools. We were sending one every semester. Now we're starting to send 3 professors every semester, so that every single university will have a lecture series of 3 to 5 days with 6 to 10 lectures to enrich them and sort of keep them on track as far as quality, raising the level of excellence of the studies.
That is absolutely fascinating. So the faculty members here from Israel, do they take their families when they go there, or they go for a few months on their own? How does that work in general?
No. So it's they go for 2 weeks.
Just for 2 weeks.
Yes, and that's why we need to send a number of faculty. Okay. They give 3 to 5 days at each university. They each do 3 to 4 universities, and then because everybody volunteers.
Really?
Yes, they do it because they're committed to advancing the China-Israel relationship, and because it's an extremely exciting experience to interact in China with Chinese in a developed program. We're able to offer the Israelis who we send or take an unparalleled experience because we've basically laid the groundwork. We've established the relationships. We have the programs. I mentioned earlier the Beijing scholars. We have an incredible network there, and we take experts like experts and people from ex-government, former Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Dori Gold. We've taken Major General Yaakov Amidror. He's come with us 3 times to China. Just got back last month. We recently traveled there with Don Katarivas, who works in the commercial section has worked in the commercial section of the Israeli government. General Uzi Dayan came with us a number of years ago. And when they join us, they're introduced to a very interesting and broad range of Chinese experts, government officials, party officials, where they not only can share their insights about Israel and the Middle East, but they have an opportunity to learn about what China's thinking about on both a regional and global strategic level.
So years ago, I remember speaking to someone who was doing business in China, and he said one of the fears of doing business in China, and it's very tempting to do it, and he was in retail and it costs much less, is the idea that the Chinese will then take the information and then start doing it on their own and cut out the companies that are coming in there. So when if you're bringing in Israeli companies, and you started speaking about innovation also, and is there a concern that maybe they're just trying to mine Israelis or for some of the ideas that we have and then run with it on their own? Is that at all a concern? And the reason that I'm asking this is not to be provocative at all. I'm really trying to understand, because is China a friend or not of the West? There's so many conflicting ideas out there about exactly what China's goals are. If it's really If 1 out of every 4 people on the planet are Chinese, is this a country that's looking to be a global power? Is it looking to be a global power in a good sense and lead the world into a good place, or for its own reasons? I know this is a complicated question. I don't know if you can even answer it. But these are some of the things that interest me so very much when it comes to what China is.
I think the most important thing to understand is that China's cultural history is not Judeo-Christian. They like I mentioned at the beginning, they had a very isolated growth period where they developed their own way of thinking that it has, from thousands of years ago, was collective-oriented as opposed to individualistically oriented. That and for many other reasons, the powerful impact of Confucianism, the specific topographical nature of the land of China, which has very little arable land, has given them a particular and very specific history that has led to an idiosyncratic view of themselves and the world. So one of the issues that we in the West need to think about is not looking at China through our own prism, and not assuming that the Chinese think like we do or do things like we do. And when I say we, it's the general we. We're Israelis. Right. But Israel is more, generally, we're very much East and West. Mm-hmm. But our East is Middle East, and it's not so much Far East. So, for all intents and purposes, you can say we're part of the Western Bloc. And we see things differently, we do things differently, and when we assume that the Chinese are acting in certain ways because that's how we would do it, we're making a grave error. We're misinterpreting their actions. You can describe what they do accurately and still misinterpret the implications of those actions. And I've seen it done many times by scholars who are real experts on China. It is very difficult to get outside your own head and see things from the perspective of the other. Having said that, China is now, as Xi Jinping said in the recent 19th Party Congress, they've entered a new era. This is a new China that no one's really ever seen before. Until 2-3 years ago, it was very easy to say that China would never interfere in anyone else's domestic issues. And even Xi Jinping came out recently and said publicly, China will not interfere in the domestic issues of the countries of the world. So China is definitely complex and evolving so quickly that it's difficult for the West and the rest of the world to keep up. I think it may even be difficult for some of China to keep up.
It sounds like.
It's gone through a transformation like no other country ever has in the history of the world. So I just take a step back to a simpler question. You asked about tourism. This is a symbol of China's development. China has, to a great extent, a capitalist economy, not totally, but to a great extent. And building wealth has been one of the goals of the leadership, the wealth of the people. So definitely those poor people who over the last 40 years were raised to be middle and upper class now have a tremendous amount of disposable income and are traveling the world. The recent huge growth in tourism in Israel, we can credit to a certain extent to our Ministry of Tourism and our former ambassador Vilnai, who took it as a goal to increase China's tourism to Israel. This was advanced by our government, which succeeded to sign a 10-year visa agreement, which means when you go and get a visa, it will last you for 10 years. China only has that with a couple of other countries. I think Israel only has that with a couple of other countries. So it is a testament to the trust that each one has for the other to a certain extent. And the Chinese are genuinely interested in the country of Israel, the land of Israel. You might find it amazing, but as early as third grade, they start to learn about the Dead Sea. So all Chinese, when they come to Israel, the first place they want to see, of course, is the Dead Sea and what it feels like to float in the Dead Sea. So we see the commercial section side of that advancing, where new airline, Hainan Airlines, new for Israel, established direct flights. So now it wasn't only El Al with direct flights 3 times a week. Hainan did 3 times a week, and because everything was full, now they're expanding to Shanghai. It's not only Beijing, Tel Aviv, now it's going to be Shanghai, Tel Aviv, direct flights, and Cathay Pacific added lines to Hong Kong. So all these flights are full. There's so much business now going on between China and Israel and tourism, etc. When I came back last month with General Amidror and Signal staff, I would say 70% of the plane was Chinese tourists coming here. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, we see that here. We know that the Ministry of Tourism is offering free courses in Chinese for tour guides because they just don't have enough tour guides for the number of tourists that are coming in.
Yes, and in general, there's a lot of business activity. But at the same time, the issue you raised regarding IP, intellectual property protection, that has also gone through many different evolutions in the last 5 or 7 years, where the Chinese leadership has come to take IP more seriously. They're starting to develop their own IP. So this issue of actually stealing IP is reducing, but the general Chinese approach in how to do business and what constitutes a win-win business relationship that they very much support is still not necessarily leading to actual the potential being realized between the two countries. There's many challenges in doing business between our two countries, and I think China has this problem globally. How they see the business relationship, what they expect to get out of it, their demands, and what they can do because they have such a huge market and because they have a state-controlled market. So they can prevent other countries from having access to specific markets within China that in more free and democratic states, it's very difficult for us to create such limitations. So there's an imbalance, an asymmetry between China and many Western nations in how business is conducted. That's not to say both sides don't have a lot to gain, but we still have a long way to go to understand each other. And I think it's also incumbent upon the Chinese to understand how to do better business, better meaning more equal win-win between China and other countries, because they want to see an improvement in global society. One of Xi Jinping's, yes, absolutely. I mean, in the 19th Party Congress, in that 3.5-hour speech on the Chinese work plan, a shared future and common interests was one of the key issues that Xi Jinping focused on. So he very much sees that we're all in it together, and we all have to work towards a common goal of a shared future. If that's the case, which he says it is, then China's going to have to understand a little bit more about how we envision, or how the West envisions and how the world envisions their definition of the future, and cooperation amongst great powers, be it U.S., China, or others, in order to cooperate effectively for the greater good of everyone. At the end of the day, China is such a large landmass, a large population, a lot of foreign reserve, a rich country, and that carries a lot of weight. And when you have so much weight, every step you take causes a reverberation. You need to step carefully.
So I was in Los Angeles a few weeks ago, and I was in downtown LA, and someone was pointing out buildings to me, actually, that the Chinese have bought in Los Angeles, and I'm sure not just in Los Angeles. So on that level, there seems to be a concern that is China buying up property. Why is it buying up property in other parts of the world? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? How are they vis-a-vis their neighbors? I mean, here we are, we're sitting in Israel, which is not anywhere close to China. But how are the people near the China Sea seeing China? Is it just looking like a country that just wants everything to be good for everybody? We'll export what we have, you'll export what you have, and or is there something else going on here that are we grasping, not grasping, because we really don't understand China? I don't even know if this question is clear, let alone the answer. The answer's up to you.
Okay. So you're getting into very complex issues. I have a
very intelligent audience. They expect depth.
Last year, China lost a case in the South China Sea against the Philippines with respect to the construction that they're building up islands in the South China Sea, and they continue to do that. They have a new port in Djibouti, which is supposed to be for commercial protection and to anti-piracy. They purchased the port in Piraeus in Greece. They are definitely taking many steps that are causing their region to, in some cases, be concerned, in some cases to open, wider discussions. The U.S. has a certain role in this because the U.S. isn't taking the same lead that it took in the past, and the Chinese are not necessarily filling in any vacuum, but they're definitely taking note of the rebalancing that's taking place. And I think everyone in the China region sees that they have a challenge, how to balance their relations between the U.S. and China, how to cultivate successful relations with China, maintain their own integrity. There's a lot on the table. It's difficult for everyone and challenging for everyone, and there's definitely a strong learning curve for the international community.
It seems like a lot of pieces are being shifted around on that global table anyhow. Is Russia a superpower anymore? Was it not for a few minutes, and now it is again with Putin? Is the United States still a superpower? Is Israel a superpower? It seems like they're sometimes accidental superpowers coming here, like countries that are suddenly realizing that maybe they can punch above their weight. So Israel, in certain ways, like we've seen in the past couple of decades, when it comes to technology, when it comes to even water, desalination, and the role that we can play in helping a world that needs more fresh water than it has. And it sometimes I think that that's what's happening with China too, that they maybe didn't intend to be a superpower, and suddenly, because of some of the wealth that they have now, maybe their elbows are, they're moving their elbows a little bit in areas that they are not even sure where they're going. Is that what you see it a little bit?
No. China sees America as the superpower still. China definitely now feels that it's ready to be a global power, and they want their fair seat at the table. And that is not accidental. That is part of the natural development of the country in its maturity as a nation. You know, we always say Israel is a young state. We have a lot of growth yet to experience. America as a state has been around for 270 whatever years. And even though both of us have very long histories, in our modern form, we were in 48, China in 49, we are still learning. China has gone from abject poverty to wealth. They've gone from strict communism to a communist, capitalist, socialist, very complex system, which is unlike any other system that you would see. For example, it's not commonly known that on the very local level, on the village and town level, they have elections. There's actually a democracy. And at the very top, they have a total meritocracy where you have to go through, pass through many, many obstacles and learn and develop a wide skill set in order to be part of the leadership. And in the middle, there's a great deal of experimentation that goes on in how to manage the society. And China is always trying to learn. I have to give them tremendous credit. When Foreign Minister Wang Yi came to Israel a few years ago, he, through the embassy, asked to set up a seminar on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And the embassy contacted Signal, and we helped them set up this academic seminar where scholars came from both sides, from the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. And Wang Yi led an academic discussion to better understand and convey his views and hear their side on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Have you ever heard any leader at his level to come and address academia as a path towards the process of a solution? So learning is, I think it's very difficult for us to appreciate the degree to which learning plays a role in China's day-to-day politics. They're always doing outreach to learn from other countries and gain best practices so they can implement them and run their country in the best way possible. And the system that they have developed, they believe now has reached a certain level of maturity that can serve as a model for certain other countries.
I can see why they would have some kind of leaning then towards Jews, because that's something that's been huge with us over the years, is the education, constant education, and to teach our children and that constant learning. And okay, in our cases, because we were getting tossed out of from one country to the other, and all you can take with you sometimes is what's in between your ears. But if they value that, if they value education, information, and the seeking of information, I can see very much why there would be an affinity with Israel. So on a family level, and I don't know if you're familiar at all with what goes on, there used to be a law that you could only have one child. Do they have more of traditional family units still, you know, the ideal being a father, mother, and a child or two? Have they been affected with some of what's going on, let's say, in Europe, where you have a lot of single-family homes, more of the feminism? Is any of that relevant at all to China?
I am not aware of any movement that leads to single-family homes. Mm-hmm. The traditional family is definitely the way that China... There, due to the one-child policy, there is a certain shortage of women in China for a certain age group. But now it's a two-child.
Because they aborted a female fetus? For that reason?
Yes, in certain areas. Mm-hmm. Now it's two-child family, and the discussion is that soon that will end as well. And I would say China is relatively traditional when it comes to that, and their family values are very similar to Jewish family values: children first, children and children's education first. And when you interact between Chinese and Jews, that is the two things that the conversation usually starts with is, oh, we both have an ancient history, and oh, we both are very family-oriented, and education is number one. So this is almost a mantra among the Chinese that they share that with the Jewish people.
Do you see just as many women in academia there or in the business world as you see men, or it's traditional in the sense of the woman's in the home and the man is out in the workforce?
Well, I'm sorry to tell you that it's very much like Israel. A lot of women are working, but they're not necessarily in the highest places. I'm in the field I'm working. Often I'm one of the only women in the room, and I'm taking Israelis and Chinese, or I'm dealing with Israelis and Chinese. There are some cases where there are, women are, like here, women are gaining more and more status, but for women everywhere in developed societies, it's difficult, not to mention developing societies. So I would say that their situation is, there's chauvinism in China. But yes, but it's a chauvinism. You feel extremely safe in China. You can walk almost anywhere at any hour. It's a very, very safe place, and you feel safe. It's the society, in many aspects of the society and the way the society is run, that it's safe.
So like theft and rape and all the things that when we walk around, in the Western world, right? If you're going to go into the mall and you're going to come out late, you don't park at the very, very end, so you're going to be walking to your car alone. They don't have that there? Is it because there's a lot of police, or just because there's very little tolerance for that kind of behavior in the society?
I'm sure there are pockets, but in general, I think it's traditional society. And like you said, it's not like an overwhelming number of police. It is that it's more about tolerance, as you noted.
And how are they with tourists there? So we spoke about them coming here to the West and going around the world now, learning about the world. Are they open to tourists coming there, or they're still not so used to seeing non-Chinese faces around, and it's difficult for them?
That's such an interesting question. Lots and lots and lots of tourists come to China, yet the Chinese ability to speak to them in the global language of English is shockingly limited. In places like Shanghai, where you've had foreigners for 150 years, people don't speak English in five-star hotels. I mean, their English is very broken. So it's difficult for Chinese to learn English. And in fact, Lee Kuan Yew, the first leader, I believe president of Singapore, could be prime minister.
Edit that out, Ben.
Lee Kuan Yew wrote that one of the things that made Singapore such a successful nation so quickly was that they prioritized English over Chinese. They're a majority ethnically Chinese country. But they took a decision, Lee Kuan Yew took a decision that if they were going to be globalized as an small island nation, they needed that global communication skill. And so their first language is English. And actually, he recommended to China that they should do the same. But of course, for cultural reasons, China could never do that. So they do start learning English at a relatively young age, but their teachers are mainly Chinese, just like we suffer from the same problem here. Although you do have many people who speak English in Israel, the quality of the English and the accent of the English is not consistently good. So you need to have native language speakers so you can hear it. And so the language issue is definitely a limitation, but the pull of Chinese culture and the vast array of what you can see in China, it's a tremendous nation, with everything from religious monuments to outstanding landscapes and very warm people, very welcoming, absolutely.
So you said before that they have little arable land. They have to import most of their food?
I don't have the statistics, but yes, they do have to import a lot of grain, and it's not the optimal situation as far as they're concerned. And they have purchased land in many countries in order to grow it and bring it to China.
So can you tell us what Israel sends there?
Israeli export to China is somewhat limited. there is a great deal of improvement in the trade growth. I'm told that in 2017, our exports to China are up by 30%. But I can tell you that until 2017, the great majority of the trade was imports. And the exports were limited. Most of the exports, about 80% of the small percentage of export, was limited to two major companies. So our ability to export to China is suffering from the same problem as many countries. Right. It's difficult to export to China.
They're protecting their own to some degree. They're not letting exports in as much as other countries would.
You know, it's very complicated. It's not like they're blocking exports, but in order to do business in China, you really have to understand how China works. And that takes a very long time, which makes it expensive. And especially for Israeli companies, which tend to be on the smaller side, they just don't have the longevity to and the cash flow to invest in the long-term relationships and the long-term research and due diligence that it takes in order to be successful.
Although if you look at a market of 1.5 billion people, that's good incentive, no?
That's why people keep trying. And in spite of the fact that there are, high risks and many failures, if you do succeed, it's a big hit.
So one last question, and then I'll let you get back to your important work. Politically speaking, so China, you said at the beginning of the interview, had formed kind of a bloc with the Arabs many, many years ago, over half a century ago. But now it's a new dawn, and they're coming out to the world, and they have relations with Israel and universities and scholars, etc. Is it all showing up on the political arena? Do you see hope for that happening? That where Israel has a lot of trouble, let's say like the UN and the the Security Council in different places where Israel is just sometimes Micronesia's with us, and that's about it. Or issues now, for example, one of the big issues is Jerusalem, the capital. What do you think are the chances of China really bucking other countries and saying, well, we're going to stand with Israel on certain things? Do you see it at all? A lot of the relationships that you're helping to build, do you see it all parlaying itself into any kind of political difference here?
So China's way of doing things will not lead to a great change in their political stance in the near future. They always vote against Israel in the United Nations and in every other international forum. It was very frustrating to see them vote against us in UNESCO with respect to Har Bayit, the wall. Yes. Right. And we raised that with the Chinese. It's very complicated for them. They have many different things to weigh when they're making those choices. There are a lot of there are still many alliances that they have with the Arab world, which are important to them, with the Muslim world.
Well, I would say if they need oil to run their factories, that might be one of the big factors there, no?
It's actually not that simple anymore because they get a great deal of oil from Russia. They sign now with the United States. Oil and gas can be found in a lot of different places, but their relations with Iran are broad. The sales, you talk about trade, their sales to the Arab world are infinitely larger, of course, than the sales to Israel because of the difference in the size of our markets. And they see the Arab world as a bloc, and then Israel is separate. So there's no way we can compete. I think that there are many things that China wants and needs from Israel, and I think it's up to Israel and Israel's leadership to convey to China how it's in their interest to adjust, to make some rebalancing in the way they approach their political thinking with respect to Israel. It's not only up to China. Israel needs to explain and convey an understanding to them and show how it will be to everyone's benefit. So until that happens, I don't see a great deal of change in the near future.
Who is our ambassador now to China? I don't even know.
Ambassador Zvi Chefetz. He's an outstanding ambassador. He is an appointee and was in Russia before he came to China. And he's probably one of the best ambassadors for China I could imagine. And yes, I'm a big fan. He's doing an excellent job. And I'm very happy that we're able to work with him and the embassy and the many ministries in Israel in order to advance China-Israel relations through our academic framework.
Mm-hmm. Is there a technion? Is there a university?
Yes. So you really hit the nail on the head when you said that because China wants to become innovators, so maybe they want to have a university, and they got what they wanted. They managed to have an arrangement with the Technion that they made a wealthy Hong Kong Chinese made an important contribution to the Technion that resulted in the Technion agreeing to set up a branch, or the Technion Guangdong University in southern China.
Mm-hmm. The Technion being one of Israel's premier universities, for my listeners who might not know.
Okay, so the Technion is the MIT of probably the Middle East,
right,
and the only MIT that's all run by Jews, and that gave it an extra added cachet for the Chinese. Mm-hmm. And what's wonderful about the Technion for the Chinese is that it specializes in innovative development of technology that can be commercialized. So we're not talking about the Weizmann Institute that does pure sciences. Right. They're interested in sort of the more practical results of technology and science that comes out of the Technion.
Okay, and Israel has established a branch there. So when we talk about maybe Israel saying they have what to lose also, perhaps, as time goes on, that Israel has a lot to offer. And I think we're all realizing, or we should be realizing, that the world runs on mutual interests, not necessarily love affairs or understanding or wanting to be like the other. But we have something that they need, and they have something that we need, and that's how it goes. So anything else you'd like to add? This is a pretty broad-ranging interview, but anything else that we didn't cover that you did want to say?
No, I think you did an outstanding job of covering some of the most challenging topics with respect to China and the world. I think that, just in closing, I would say to your audience, when you're looking at what China is doing, it's important to try to understand from their perspective where it's coming from, and to understand a little bit about how China works and what makes it tick. And things will become more clear, and then we as a nation, the nation of Israel or the United States, will all be able to address whatever issues there are much more effectively.
So do you have a suggestion for a resource if somebody wants to really learn more about China and what makes China tick? Are there books, are there websites, obviously not in Chinese, in different languages, that you would see people using as a valuable and pretty factual or honest resource without an agenda?
There are a number of research institutes in Washington, D.C. that are doing great work on China. CSIS is one of them. I don't remember what that stands for.
See, it's probably for China?
No?
Center for something.
Yeah, okay. It's something like the Center for, but you.
Okay.
They have. They put out a great deal of China analysis. There's another source called Merix, which comes out of Germany. They do outstanding analysis of China. And there's a small organization called SUP China, S-U-P China. They put out a great podcast and a regular editorial on all the news that's fit to print for that week, which gives, in a few minutes, you get tremendous insights into what's happening in China now. So I think for the bigger picture, you look at these other institutes like CSIS and Merix, and SUP China can give you a good day-to-day understanding of what's going on in China. We try to follow all of them. They're excellent.
Okay. Can people be in touch with you if, let's say, I have listeners living here in Israel also who want to maybe deepen their understanding or their business ties or their scholarly ties with China?
Of course, our door is always open, and we're very happy, especially for your listeners, to guide. You
get a discount if you say you heard it here on Rejuvenation.
Yeah, free of charge. Any advice, guidance, and direction that anybody's interested in, of course, we're very happy to help. Anything to contribute, especially to building the China-Israel relationship.
Okay, so that would be sino-israel.org. Fantastic. Carice, thank you so much. I learned a lot. I know my listeners did too. And I really appreciate you taking the time. And you're doing wonderful work. I'm so glad that somebody's doing this. I'm glad it's you.
Thank you so much, and it was very interesting to have the discussion with you. I'm actually very impressed with your ability to focus on so many of the key issues that are important to the China-Israel relationship, and I look forward to doing this again sometime.
All right, everybody. Thank you for listening. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. Write to me. Love your feedback. Eve@thelandofisrael.com. Take care, everybody. Goodbye for now.
Hanukkah light burns so bright. Hanukkah, Hanukkah, come light the menorah. Up in my laughter's in the air sometimes. Light one candle for the Maccabee children.
Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow, host of Rejuvenation. On behalf of myself and all of the hosts and wonderful staff behind the Land of Israel Network, I want to wish all of you a happy Hanukkah, a joyous festival of lights, and may we here at the Land of Israel Network continue to shine the light of Israel.